I think everybody knows who you are. We'll give a brief history on kind of skill acquisition as it is, and then kind of talk a little bit about the difference between each of the models. Kind of people that really know your state of position. I'll give mine, and then we'll kind of go from there because I think you and I agree on a lot of things. There's just some nuance that I think maybe you and I would have fun playing with some ideas that yeah. So you're the guy to talk to on that stuff. So I thought it'd be beneficial.
Cool, man. Yeah, whatever you want. Let's get it.
All right, cool. So, I mean, a lot of times this debate I think is had in a space where a lot of people aren't even really understanding what you're trying to say a lot of the times.
For sure.
And yeah, and so what I think happens, you spend a lot of time just trying to convey your ideas, and it gets really frustrating for you. And so I saw a comment that you made that I thought was really pertinent, kind of to the heart of the discussion that I kind of wanted to start with to set the tone. In one of your videos, I think you were talking to Mike Israetel, and someone was coming after you saying like you're not doing a good job of kind of embodying the argument that you need to make. And I thought what was cool about what you said to them was something along the lines of like, dude, I'm trying my best. I'm trying to figure this out on the fly. Um, and that's kind of like a cool little kind of show of what you're trying to do. And I'm trying to embody that same thing today. So I guess we'll get into it. Does that sound cool?
Yeah, man. Yeah, no worries.
All right, so you're a big proponent of the ecological dynamics, but more specifically the CLA approach. And when you're debating people, a lot of times they're reverting back to very old traditional views of schema theory. So for the people who are listening, kind of it goes schema theory, which is just these generative models that are kind of like robotic in nature. They're almost like folder storage, and then next kind of came predictive processing, which was trying to kind of make the brain sound like a machine. And it kind of in the same fashion did these predictive hierarchy sequences where the brain had to think about its process and then do what it's supposed to do. And then CLA came along and kind of revolutionized the learning in stating that you can't separate perception and action. These two are indistinguishable. They have to work in unison. So am I doing well so far?
Well, I mean, for the listeners, we probably don't have to go any deeper than
Yeah,
that.
right. Right, right. And I'm going to just wrap up with the final thing is now there's this new thing called active inference. And these kind of four models are kind of what's debated, and they drive practice design at the end of the day. And so I kind of wanted to start there. And were you comfortable with kind of that quick summary?
Oh yeah, like I said, because I mean, to understand any of those four things that you just mentioned, people are going to have to do their work anyway.
Yeah,
So I don't think neither of you or I could do this justice because it would take an hour to describe each and how they transition from one to the other,
right,
how the
right.
historical context from the original conversation that started thousands of years ago, hundreds of years ago, got to this. It would just be ridiculous. So yeah, that's good enough, I suppose.
Okay, all right, yeah, and I agree. And so I kind of wanted to just touch on because I do agree this is going to take a lot of time to parse out certain things. But I think the main difference between you and I is ultimately, well, first, spoiler alert, ecological dynamics and the CLA approach is the main backbone to skill acquisitions, definitely in jujitsu. And so I think you're spot on with a lot of the things you say. I know people have had pushback on your opinions on like Mike was saying, moderating 30%, and you're like, what is that metric? And so all these other questions. I guess the place where you and I differ, and this is where I would like to have this conversation, is the role in the brain's function, right? In the cognitive parts of things and arts of deception and things of those natures. That's kind of where the space I wanted to explore because I think that implicates a lot about practice design and what the role of the coach in those moments.
Okay.
Um, so, like, I guess the question to start out with for you would be like, when you're, for example, if you're looking at a scenario where perhaps I'm looking to create for you, you would say like the create be attuned to the affordances that are going on in the environment to pick up on what data you need to make a decision, to drive a decision, or that decision is completely engaged with that perception. So what is the art of deception and feinting and things like that to you when you're designing a practice, and what does that look like?
Well,
And like philosophically, how are you doing that?
okay, so let's imagine that the information that we're picking up to act is external to ourselves, and where
Direct
within a
perception.
context where we're engaging in a back and forth in some way. Let's say a takedown battle where I'm trying to grab a hold of you and put you down, and you're trying to grab a hold of me and put me down.
Yeah.
When you move towards me, I perceive movement forward based on either my previous experience, or current capacity, my current skill level. How I perceive motion coming to me could look like one thing versus another. So the information of movement, let's say I'm not familiar with it, but just a little bit, could seem more sudden, or could seem faster, or could seem like they were coming at me at that moment. The decision was made relative to my current attunement to that level of information. Um, and let's say a guy knew a little more than me, but it wasn't real. It just a little bit. So, oh my God, he's coming near me, and I respond to it, and then he capitalized on my response because it wasn't real. I don't know what the brain's role for me would be outside of just perceiving movement and then acting accordingly. Um, Deception in my mind is a relationship between the intentions of the other person, that black box of intention from them, and how I perceive him as an object in front of me. They're fighting each other. You know what I mean? Because I see movement, I perceive action, I think it is the thing that I think it is based on my level of perception, but it's up to him whether it is or not. And I can't really predict that, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean that was I mean you did a really uh, I love a lot of what you said, and I guess maybe what ends up happening for you and I is this just a fundamental difference on how we see the brain's role in that action. And I get, like you said, I don't want to get too lost in the sauce because I don't think it'll be fun for the listener. But in my interpretation of that exchange in that moment, which from an ecological standpoint, that to me was flawless. And I guess in my view of that, there is a almost in the world of active inference, they would see the brain as a modulator in that scenario, and it would be constantly casting predictions of what that moment would be like. And they don't separate cognition from perception and action. It stays in that feedback loop. So in that model, in that view, and this is my kind of take here, is that there's a little more art and deception, that you're creating, you're actually manipulating the maybe the person who's doing whatever they're doing. They're manipulating the scenario in which you're reading. So you call it affordances and attunement to affordances. And I guess what where we differ is like how we would teach that. And so from a practice design, let me give to you how I foresee that scenario. I would potentially, we'll use the same example that you were discussing with takedowns. Um, the way I would be changing, so it would be task related. We wouldn't deconstruct it like you, right? We would leave it inside the system. But from a teaching point of view, we would be potentially looking at predicting predictable outcomes. So, like, if this person is in a certain position where our free energy state doesn't want that to be out of alignment with what our perception is. And if those two realities meet, then in that scenario, our system is regulated. So when I'm teaching that from like a coach point of view, what we would be looking is also speaking to that person about looking for either predictive qualities in their movement. That way you can start now having counter responses to those movements. So you are pre-planning in a way. Does that make sense? That's a tough
Mm.
thing to.
Well, I know there's kind of a lot there. So
Yeah, I know
first,
there's a
I
lot
mean,
to unpack.
cognition, perception, action, I'm fine with them being coupled. I actually don't have a deep issue with cognition. To whatever level it operates with the perception action, we're doing it, we do it. It's a function that exists in us. I
Perfect. Okay,
guess,
that's
but
cool that you even.
but
Yeah.
well, to me, I don't think it's that important because
Okay.
when we're saying cognition, what do we really mean? Do we mean the neural circuitry that we are using to perceive something, or are we talking about the level of awareness where we define the thing we think we're perceiving? And we have to ask the second question: if we're talking about the awareness we think we're perceiving, does that operate on the same level as movement response? Because the level of cognition of awareness, as we often know, does not really operate at that level. I mean, a quick bit of anecdotal evidence for that: you can ask an athlete what happened, and they can't tell you.
Right.
Even a high
Right.
level
Right.
athlete, they don't remember it, they didn't see it, or if they did, their recollection of what just happened was, when you look back on tape, wasn't what happened. So again, it's not that we don't cognate, it's not that it's not part of the system, it's that at what level does cognition operate, and is it operating at the level of perception action in the moment for the movement?
Yeah. Yeah. So I love this. This is awesome. So, um, I didn't. I've never heard you say that, so that's fantastic to even recognize that there is some form of cognition. And I kind of figured you would say, to what degree does that cognition impact kind of decision making? And I don't know the answer. I think that would be a fair statement to say. But I think there's a chasm between the world of cognitive neuroscience and ecological studies, and trying to fill that gap, I think, is where the nuance lies in hybrid approaches. And that's where I see kind of the constraints led approach as like the main toolbox. But then I do think that there's predictive qualities that we should be potentially training in practice and using more. And I hate the word explicit learning, because that's not what I mean, because I don't believe you can do that for the most part in
So
nature.
if there
I said a lot. I
is,
want to I want to let you
for
unpack
sure,
that.
if there's a predictive quality of the system, let's say we do, okay, what suggests that explicit talking or instruction informs that predictive function? What if the predictive function happens at a level that's even faster than we can cognate? So what if it's happening at a neurological level, like a twitchy level, a level that where awareness doesn't even touch? And why do we assume that talking to people about it makes them aware of that function?
Oh, great. Perfect. Well, that was short and succinct. So, a couple things. One, I agree. If we're talking specifically about explicit instruction separated from the activity itself in any decontextualized manner, it's useless. That is almost irrefutable at this point.
For sure.
Yeah, so I'm on the same page with you on that. So, what I guess, if I want to dig a little deeper in this again, why I think it drives practice design is. I believe if it's coupled with, and you might use this kind of verbal instruction as a constraint, while if it's coupled with the behavior that's going on, whether it's cueing them to hold on to the hip or doing some external focus like keep your belly button attached to their back, however you want to use that constraint. Um, to me, there's potentially well, I mean, you said a lot. So are we on the same page that you might be using verbal constraints that I just named like that to identify affordances? Would be on the same page there.
I think talking to somebody about what you want them to do is in itself a constraint, and I think it's in a particular a constraint towards search for the information source. So
Yep.
when I try to convey something to somebody and I tell them to do something, I'm basically pointing them at that thing, and I think that we're pointing someone at the thing in multiple levels. One, vision, look in that area. An action-oriented level, try to do this thing, and a perceptive level, how they're interacting. And so I think our words can affect, let's say, if they're worth those three component parts of the system. But really, once it sets out off into play, I think something else takes over that our words can't get at.
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
our
yeah.
words at best attune or point the thing at the information, but they don't do much else.
Okay. Wow. So we are just slightly off from each other. So I agree a lot that so the words in the moment, the live scenario, we are then operating probably on some form of flow state, and we're not quite sure what we want to call that. And you and I that's a different kind of conversation from exactly what we're having right now. But so in that moment where we're talking about the words in the training atmosphere, what I would say is happening as opposed to what you're saying, and this is just, we're cutting things, but they have big implications, I think, is that in my worldview, that engagement is confirming or denying the worldview in which you're making these predictions off of. So I'm kind of arguing from a free energy principle state. I don't know if you're kind of,
I'm aware.
if I need to even yeah,
No.
yeah, I figured. But yeah, so that's kind of where I'm arguing from. And if that's, that distinction right there, the chasm between neurology and the mechanistic end of cognition and how that impacts, yeah, you're shaking your
Yeah,
head.
it's too much reductionism for me. I see. I can't
Okay.
even have the conversation at this
That's what
level.
I wanted to figure out. Yeah, yeah,
Because the
yeah. Okay.
problem is we operate within context and things are happening that we are unaware of. We're operating in a nonlinear system. We don't know the input output ratios. We don't know what is affecting what. We have some clues as to what might be going on, and they're
Yeah.
actually very simple. It's context is everything. Variation is the lowest hanging fruit. What we're adapting to is novelty, and that the information that we're using, whether there is some type inside that's affecting the way we perceive and act upon the world, is definitely out there because we've seen that the movements we do are relative to context in which we perform them. So
Yeah.
it
So I guess,
basically, to me,
go ahead.
everything is just so intertwined that I don't think we can parse that out. And I actually think it's the problem with, the cognitive view, is I think they're trying to operate everything from the thought level or the cognition level, but they're not looking at reality. They're not looking at what creatures do. They're not taking everything into account. They're not taking the amount of change that's present in a given system. They're just not they're not accounting for that.
I think that's so. I clearly we fundamentally disagree in some form or fashion, and so I guess I'll give two things that I want to say. And we might not come together on this, but we run ultimately we agree on a lot of things about the ecological dynamics approach. And if you're not doing that for the most part, then you're not probably doing it right. So I'm cool with that as a broad statement. Um, and so, but to get back to what you just said, and then I'll ultimately, hopefully, just we can either tie it back to practice or just to respond ultimately. So I see the descriptive nature of the ecological dynamics approach as it's almost like looking at Newtonian physics and quantum mechanics. Like one is looking at can describe the small and the reduction end of things and the mechanistic end of things, and one describes the real life application and the experience of things. And they kind of sit at odds. And to me, the work of active inference is trying to bridge that gap. And I'm not saying you're wrong because I don't know what's going on, but if active inference or something like that, where there is kind of a modulating system that the brain operates in with where cognition is part of the active perceptive feedback loop, then that does have implications on self imagery and video work and practice structure. And so that's kind of where I wanted to just see where you were in that. I didn't know where you stood in that you felt as though like reductionist. So this is just kind of a space that I think the sport is going to dig into as it grows.
The sport barely knows we have left hands and right hands. So
Yeah.
you're more hopeful than I am. Like you
Yeah,
can't.
yeah.
And like even like I was actually joking with some people about the flow guys when they were like all pumped on DeAndre's win, and one of them picked up the book How He Learned to Move, and he picks it up and he like puts his knee up and he opens the book, and it had this similar quality to me. Like if you ever hang out with kids who want to smoke cigarettes but they never smoked a cigarette before, and they pull it out of the packet and they put it up to their lips, and you can tell by that action they've never touched a cigarette before and put it in their mouth.
Yeah.
That's what I felt like when he was holding that book. So I feel like
Well, well,
that I think
that's kind of
on a
what.
large scale, we're just a bunch of kids smoking cigarettes for the first time
Yeah.
ever.
Well, I mean, but that's kind of what makes your situation unique is, and I know you catch a lot of shit, dude, and I like, of course you do. You brought a new approach that kind of is revolutionizing jujitsu, and at some point, either people have to dig in or they're gonna get fucking left behind. I mean, that's just the real life situation that they're going to be dealt with. And I'm hoping conversations like this, where because and I know this is boring for a lot of people that are listening. I guess it ultimately didn't have it the value maybe this discussion that I was hoping for practice design, but ultimately like these implications are huge, and like you said, they cover a vast part of sports psychology, imagery, video work, all these things have massive implications. And so I wanted to dig in with you, but clearly like reductionism for you is a waste of time.
It really is because I mean, we're like if we just because ecological dynamics comes from the pragmatist tradition, like, and that's sort of where I like to sit. I mean, or really, it comes from two. And what's interesting is that these two seem at odds, but I actually don't think they are.
Well,
Like,
that's my
you
point.
know,
Maybe we're
so
arguing the same point.
so for example, I mean, you have like Gibson, who is a pragmatist, right? He
Right.
comes from that tradition. They would connect him to William James. But what they don't know is that when Gibson would teach his lectures, he would hand out Merleau-Ponty's his book on phenomenology, right? His views. So he comes from a different or like seemingly opposing point of view. But why would he give that book out, right? Because I think he was assuming the wholeness of everything when he was trying to teach the nature of perception, and so I try to stick to that. I don't think it can be parsed out. I don't think we can
So,
talk about these things. I don't think we can talk about perception, action, cognition as separate things. Cognition is a
well, I
function
think
of the organism.
Man, I guess we're arguing the same thing in many ways, but we're not. Obviously, there's a distinct difference. But active inference kind of is art trying to bridge that gap and make that argument that they're not separate. And I guess what you don't care about that I care about and the medical world cares about, and this was kind of a conversation that I think people, if you're interested in jujitsu, maybe you should turn it off. But it has huge implications on like I'm a former clinician, and so
Mhm.
it has huge implications on, and I've actually worked in the world of ecological dynamics for years because it drives a lot of the the domain I work in with the occupational therapy, we believe that humans have to be task oriented and connected to their environment. So I'm with you, and it's the debate's not the data is clear on so many different
For sure.
forms, but again. Um, what I return back to is this the role of cognition and the brain, and which you don't care. And in the world of science, we need predictability. We need the ability to have mechanistic understanding of things. We need
For
those
sure.
to drive study and drive stroke training and those kind of things. So
Right.
if there's value in that domain, I'm imagining there's got to be value in the jujitsu
Well,
domain.
the thing is, when you pull it out, you're gonna have to put it back in.
Well,
So
I believe they're together, but yes.
no, what I'm saying is if you isolate it. So let's say we isolate cognition and we get into fMRIs, we know these things. Oh, the brain is doing this, that, and the other thing. We can see maybe mechanistically what we think is happening, but again, it's happening within a system. So we can't really like it doesn't come apart. You know what I mean? And even if it
Yeah.
did, let's say we said it did this at this time for this reason, we're gonna have to figure out how it adds into everything else, how the movement affects it, how the feeling of the individual affects it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
I,
I guess you're less hopeful than I am that we're going to be able to at some point make that that kind of unifying theory, and I think it obviously it implies a lot of different well, not a lot of different coaching approaches, but I look at coaching as like a toolbox, and I guess we both use the same backbone of CLA, but I'm like CLA with an asterisk.
So
Um,
what do you think needs to be? I'm sorry, because I think what I want to hear you say it. What do you think needs to be added in to the practice design that CLA does not account for?
um,
My bad.
Yeah, no, you're fine. So I would say parts of practice. And so I believe that there's a lot of work in video prior. So talking strategy and looking at predictable outcomes. And you would probably, I guess, assume this is what would be considered increasing the capacity to see affordances. Whereas I'm framing this as you're trying to improve the likelihood of predicting predictive outcomes and matching that cognitive prediction with the actual perceptive the direct perception that goes on in the engagement of the activity.
Well, for me, direct perception is not predictive or non-predictive, not in the way I view it anyway. To me, direct perception is just the information is there. If there is a predictive mechanism, it's embedded within direct
And
perception.
that's kind of
That's it.
what yeah, and I guess that's the argument, and maybe it seems circular, but that's the argument active inference is making, that there's the cognition is part of the system. It's almost like a modulator that's constantly re-updating its next expectation of what's going on in its mental worldview.
For
And
sure.
that
And I don't think this is at odds with the view of direct perception. I mean, I read Sean Gallagher's book and I enjoyed it from front to back. And I really feel like he makes a good argument for trying to add in all the other nuances of what a human is capable of, past experiences, thoughts about themselves, imagery, all this stuff. If the capacity of an organism is to generate mental images in our head and that mental images somehow affects the way we see the world, then I'm fine with that because to me, it's not at odds. But again, for me,
well, then
what
well,
I'm
it sounds like we're very close. Then
right.
yeah, awesome. Yeah.
Well, the way I think about it is you can't engage in an effective skill acquisition unless you do the thing. That's it.
So then I guess to answer your question on how does that change practice per se, just for the listeners, so that really comes to full circle is in my idea, what would happen is you may at points be talking about like, can this person verbalize that they're seeing the change in the environment? So for example, if you're playing an open guard and I step in towards your open guard and you decide to fall to your right hip, I would be looking for that person to be able to identify what options or what they're doing. Right hip, identifying immediately that that right hip is falling, and now that if they have a more refined predictive worldview, they are now able to, and I don't, this is going to sound absolutely insane. They're able now to constrain the environment to their benefit, where you would say that's impossible, or
No,
maybe
I
you
don't,
wouldn't.
because I think
Oh,
that's
okay.
happening already. I think what I hear you saying is you want a layer of awareness to be added to it, where I think that layer of awareness does not need to be added. And the reason I'm saying this is because I mean, I know you have too. I've worked with a lot of higher level athletes. Olympians have come through here, and wrestlers have come through
Yeah.
here, people who have done major things in their sport. And they cannot verbalize what they're doing, but they can do it very well. So that suggested to me that the information is not the thoughts they have about what's happening, but their direct connection to the thing that's happening relative to their current capacities at any
Uh,
given time.
Fantastic statement. And I guess where we maybe stand at odds right there is online versus offline potentially, and how much value is in offline information versus online information. Would that be a fair assessment that
Well,
maybe we?
I mean, that's to me, again, that's too definitive, it's too strong to say the value here, the value there. I don't believe in linearity. I don't know where value lies because I don't know what affects what, because I don't believe in component parts. I believe in the reciprocal nature of the interaction.
Mm,
So everything about an individual, everything affects their performance outcomes, everything.
I would agree
So
with that statement.
what everything means, I think, is it's almost imparsible. So I think the job of a coach is to recognize what causes the certain things to emerge based on the relationships they have with their athlete and the relationship their athletes have with what they're doing. A coach is part of that system. And I think our major tool is recognition, if we can't even recognize what's going on, and then designing around what we think we recognize to try to affect change in the athlete. And so what that means, I have a student who's very sensitive to video watching. They like to look at elite performers do something similar to them, and that has a positive net effect in the way they engage in practice, then that would be the recommendation. But I wouldn't use that as a sole source of recommendation for anybody outside the athlete that I know it affects. So again, because I don't think there are specific things. I
No.
think there are.
So we have a very, very similar, but it's so funny. We're very fundamentally we are very different, but we have a very similar worldview. Because I mean, you're very. Are you aware with who Dave Collins
No.
is at all? Kind of. So he's just kind of well, he's not coming onto the scene. He's got a PhD, and I believe his it's a cognitive psychology, and he's recently coined terms like I believe it's like pragmatic judgment and decision making as coaching. And so I mean you're describing a lot of it. It's just you only are seeing things. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it
No,
seems
please.
through the ecological lens, and there's this a level of awareness that I believe exists within that system. And those two things ultimately don't, I guess, matter. We
No,
just
no.
wonder what the
Well, I see the things you're talking about. When you talk about awareness, I see this as a function. I see this as a
yeah
thing
yeah
that we do. But what I'm questioning is our ability to verbally describe the level of awareness that we can operate in a non-urgent environment. I don't think has an effect on our ability, or at least a net positive one always, to affect our ability to respond in an implicit urgent environment. Do you know what I mean?
yeah
Uh,
absolutely. And
so I
I've
think
seen your go ahead.
I think the system functions at multiple levels. And
I
we
agree.
actually
I
see
agree.
this
I agree.
bore out in experiment. So the more explicit we make a task and the more continuous and complex the game, the lower the performance outcomes we see. So this
Right.
is suggesting that there are things that are happening in certain time scales to the individual that sit outside of or below our awareness of what's happening. Like even example of I think baseball bores us out quite a bit with hitting balls, right?
Yeah.
Like everything a batter thinks is happening is not happening,
Can't happen.
um, because it's happening faster than they can have awareness of.
Right.
So anyway, again, we are aware there is a certain level that we can think to, but I think it's directly connected to the urgency or the complex nature of the environment in which we're engaging.
Okay. So I think again we're really really close to each other in many ways. But again, I have another question for you, and this is kind of now pulls into the just the coaching domain as a whole. And I think this impacts. So this might be fun for athletes. This is something I've thought through many times that I thought was fun to kind of bring to your table. So how would you solve the problem? And this seems at maybe too far of a stretch, but the problem of like performance anxiety issues with whether it be fear or something like that. Um, I have an idea of how that would be solved from like an active inference point of view, but I'm curious how you would be dealing with that from a performance standpoint with ecological um,
So two
views.
two things that I've tried to do historically, and I don't know what lens this is looked at through.
Yeah,
But my first is exposure. So I think exposure to the things that give us anxiety, it could go in either direction. It could increase it so much that we just never engage in that behavior anymore, or it starts to reduce it. I think the relationship we build with our emotional experiences can help alleviate some of the things that the emotional experience causes. So, as you know, for people with anxiety, storytelling, trying to predict what's going to happen before it's even happened. This thought, this droning thing that goes on in your head, this voice, trying to quiet that or put something else in its way so that it does not take over during performance. And even one of the ways that we do this, or we avoid choking, is to avoid explicit thoughts and explicit instruction. We try to find a way to reduce
externalize,
the
right?
thought noise,
Yeah,
externalize, right?
yeah.
I mean, I read a little bit in CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, and one thing they use in that field is called trigger words. And so what you do is they suggest that you pick a word that gives you an emotional response. Like I said, you know, something silly like "I'm the man." If that makes you giggle and it sounds silly to you, like pick that word because it clearly affects you emotionally. Every time you have this feeling where you don't feel you can overcome it, say to yourself, "I'm the man," and then try to overcome it. And the more that we load this trigger word, saying it to ourselves can start to reduce the way we are viewing what's happening and reduce the amount of thinking that's going on, so we can act more implicitly. So even in one of those therapies, for example, is to reduce the amount of information coming in external to the action itself, or the information that's internally generated from our thought patterns.
Okay, so I guess we're pretty close on that as well. And what I guess this probably doesn't matter to you, but one of the things that I think is you uh, unique to what I'm asking is we can measure the central nervous system's regulatory state in these moments. And so with that said, it's kind of like we're using these therapies, whatever your, approach can clearly change the overall system's function and its ability to then engage. So there's some clear level of importance that cognition is either a priming system or it's somehow deeply ingrained in the engagement and the perception action, that closed loop system. And so I guess you and I are just continuously splitting off at the mechanism of which kind of drives this, maybe.
Well, what
um,
do you think the mechanism is?
well, I
I
think
don't know what the
there's
mechanism is.
so I think I don't either, but what I lean closer to, you don't seem to care as much about what the mechanistic pieces of the puzzle are, whereas I believe those are important, and that having measurable data in that sense is important, at least from a neuro like a cognitive neuroscience perspective. And so the driving mechanism to me is that this energy state, the human, the self-organizing system, it seeks order, right? It wants to prevent disorder, and the way it does that is by controlling, or at least trying to decrease the difference between expected outcomes and perception action. And that's what's driving the, or at least those systems are embedded.
Okay.
So I just think we maybe are just passing each other
No,
very.
I understand. Like you guys think that it's that thing that's happening that it initiates everything, right? The free energy we're using to try to, reduce uncertainty. That's fine.
Yeah.
I have no beef with that. If that's happening, that's fine, but it's happening directly. So because
Yes.
again, we have to
Yes.
think about the time scale, and I think that's the big thing. If that was central to cognition and it affected perception action relative to the performance context, we would want it to act as implicitly as it could to increase the speed of action, because we know that as urgency increases, as speed increases, as fatigue, as fear, as these like drivers, so to speak, become more intense and start to be added to the system starts to become chaotic and break apart.
Right.
So there has to be something that keeps things doable. And so we're really trying to find that line, especially in sport, because we're trying to get athletes to operate in the face of novelty and in the face of variation. So
Yeah. Yeah.
what practice interventions prepare an athlete for that? And if there is a cognitive piece and there's some cognitive intervention that we could use that we discover that's highly effective for trying to increase the implicit rate at which we express our response to variation and novelty, then so be it. I'm fine with it.
I
But
think there is, and yeah. So I think it's isolating and some of those games that we're playing and working on those predictive measures. And I guess you again, I think we've passed each other on this already, where you consider this just the ability to attune to the affordances that are presented in that
okay,
moment.
so let's talk about the predictive thing then, because it's interesting, right? So like I know how I predict, like I'm aware, I guess, to a certain degree when I'm rolling what is happening, like I guess,
Yes.
but it
Yep.
really depends because if I'm rolling with someone that's far below my skill level, the obviousness of the interactions are there.
Can
Like
you
it's almost like
stop?
I
Can
can
you
read.
stop right
Yeah,
there? Because I think that's really important. I want to let you go on right
yeah,
away, but I do think that there potentially these two systems where cognitive function can come closer to the surface when the demands of the task are much lower.
for
And then
for sure.
okay, and so then go on. I imagine you were going to then say that as the increasing cognitive demand comes in, you're not having the same kind of
Yeah,
thoughts.
right.
You're
Because I think a big key to understanding this and why it's important, especially for coaches in sport, and why we should create practice one way or another, is Scott Kelso's work. What the hell? Oh, I'm trying to think of the name of it. I can describe it, but I
that's fine.
can't.
Listen, you and I have
Okay.
consumed so many research
So here's
articles
the
at
deal.
this point. Yeah.
So here's the thing. So when they wanted to look at basically what's controlling like movement or how are we engaging with the movement that we're doing, he had people drumming or moving in phase and anti-phase. So, right. So like
Mm.
phase would be bump, 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 bump at the same time. Anti-phase is different times, right?
Mhm. Yep.
Different times like this.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
Now, what happens is if you have someone drum in phase and then you speed it up, it suddenly turns to anti-phase. So outside of our awareness, outside of our recognition, we can't stop that from happening at a certain speed. So what this suggests is that there's something that's controlling it that's not cognitive, or if it is cognitive, it's not, we're not aware of it. That whatever causes us to change the rate at which we drum our fingers becomes unstable at a certain level of interaction. So what's creating that instability? Because
Yeah.
if we can recognize where the instability is coming from, we want to restabilize a new movement pattern relative to the speed at which we're moving. Then we're going to have to understand why there's a phase transition.
Right.
Why does that exist? And if you try to, and when you try to control it cognitively, you can't.
So again, I don't know if this is out of alignment with what I'm proposing, because I think most of what the model suggests is that ecological dynamics and constraints led by, to be specific, is no undoubtedly the main antidote for skill acquisitions, especially in such sport like jujitsu, where like the probability is very high in different in varying systems, like in varying movements, right? So that makes it very different than perhaps squatting
For sure.
or something like that.
What they
And
call
I don't want to.
complex continuous. So
Right,
complex
right.
continuous tasks, CLA seems to outperform other um, training interventions.
Correct. And yes. And so that, I mean, so when people argue with you, kind of a side note for the people watching, like, so when people argue with you on that, it's kind of, it's usually because it's just super uninformed.
Yes.
And so, and I
It
don't want
is
to
what
be,
it is.
yeah, but I don't want to be rude about it, because I think there's been such a history of that kind of teaching through all, schooling, and then it's obviously echoed over and over again. And so I understand it, but yeah, I guess again, we just come back to this year. The same thing I've said before. You're not so much worried about the mechanistic end of things, and I do believe that there's at least from an offline perspective, that there might be a lot more value than perhaps your kind of view is, but and that's
Oh, okay.
fine. Um,
So let's talk about that. Actually, I want to kind of get at some of your views because everyone knows mine. So when
yeah.
you say value offline, can you please give an example of how something offline affects online interaction and where that value lies and how we can actually bore out that value?
Well, I think the first thing would be fair to say is I'm not sure. I don't truly know that answer yet. But and I think there are people who are much smarter than I am that are trying to explore that a little bit more. But I would say, by and large, what I would to connect the dots is the offline information, the knowledge of whatever.
Knowledge of is from experience. Knowledge about is factual information.
Okay, yeah. So what I'm getting at is so for example, if we're able to and this again would probably be where you consider affordances and a capacity, but what I'm hoping is, or presenting, is the function of knowledge can help that system that's looking to confirm its prior versus what its experience is in the moment with the perception and action, and that knowledge leading up to that is creating scenarios in which that agent is going to reduce the risk of error.
Sure. But again, then we would have to have the trouble of defining knowledge and how we acquire it. So, when what does even
So
mean true cognition?
well, I guess I've heard you say that before, and maybe that is so. How do we require knowledge in the world of active inference? This is obviously like a Bayesian prediction model that reinvents it constantly is updating itself. So this would start technically at birth, right? This model would be constantly updating, where the ecological world would say a baby's searching for affordances. The active inference world would say that the baby is an active learner, and its worldview is constantly updating in real time.
Right,
So
and
those would be,
I'm fine with both those things, but whether the baby is updating its worldview or because I would think the same thing in my the ecological dynamics lens. So what I think is happening based on my own personal experience, what I've read, and I'm not sold on this completely, but it seems legitimate based on what I'm seeing, is
yeah.
that what changes with knowledge is search criteria. So if information is out there, knowing how to search for it. Now, search doesn't just imply, oh, I'm thinking, I'm looking for. Search is how the organism eventually starts to organize around the information source, how their gaze behavior changes over time, how
Right.
their kinesthetic contact changes over time.
Yeah.
And so it seems like if knowledge does anything, and it gets in my view, again, this you can look it up. I don't know to what level this is happening, but it attunes the animal to keep searching in that area. You know what I mean? Because and what's really interesting about this too is if anything novel pops up in that search, it affects performance. So let's say we search an area for a thing, and again, I say area because I don't know whether it's through touch, whether it's through vision, whether it's through all of it, whether it's through the way we feel our body moving through that space, whether, I think it's being affected by everything. But again, I think what's changing is that search criteria. But if something pops up in that space that's novel, the search criteria could be informed enough to deal with the novelty, but it definitely causes a change in performance.
And I neither. So I guess we're not arguing there again. We're not arguing there because I believe that that is true, right?
Right.
That is not, that is definitely not my argument, because even in the active inference model, that would be true as well. That the error is greater than the anticipatory engagement that it had occurred. So then, in that case, it would cause destabilization of the system.
Now, what really is
So
interesting too is anticipation and prediction can happen at multiple levels. Like we see this, right? Like you can expect to see it's true in striking. Like anticipatory behavior, awareness of it has a huge positive effect. So let's say, for example, I've seen a guy lead
yeah,
with, well, it's a double-edged sword.
right, of
So
course.
if I see him leading, I'm like, okay, that means he's going to throw that thing, and he's about to throw it. I see it, boom, boom, I hit him, bang, I get a big shot. But he fakes me, and I predicted wrongly. I'm going to get crushed. But there's also another level of anticipation that's happening under the surface. This is that thing we do when we know something's happening, but it's only known through the level at which we're interacting, like what our eyes are doing, what our hands are doing, what the engagement is, and we can't really describe it. It's the sudden movement when someone shoots, for example, or that sudden twitch when someone goes in that direction. It's less, I guess, intellectual than, oh, he's doing this, therefore I will do this. But I think it's actually, but they're all anticipation, and to a degree. But again, the way that like ecological dynamics talk about it is they call it prospective control. So rather than anticipating like I'm predicting this, therefore they're constantly working to find the information, and once it's rich enough, they act upon it. So the
Yeah.
updating is happening in real time rather than these lags or these delays.
Yeah. Well, again, we are speaking so closely, but because the active inference again is so embodied with ecological dynamics that I would agree with almost everything you said. There would just be a potential, like there may be even, and I don't know this to be true, and like you had conceded earlier, like you're not very sure on sold certain ideas, and I'm about to give one myself. Um, but what would potentially be the driver in this? And I hate to say driver because it sounds like a controlled center. So I do not mean that for you
Yeah.
and anyone's listening. I'm more talking about a modulating system that's changing behavior in real time, that's driven
By something.
by some prior experience. We call it priors.
Yeah.
Right. So that system in that moment that you just described, I would then describe that more as there is some form of deception going on where I'm creating an environment where you think subconsciously, because your worldview had a different prediction model, the error is much bigger. So you become dysregulated in that moment and you are slower then to respond.
How would I know that it's having that effect on you?
We
If I
wouldn't.
was if I was the deceiver and I
Yes.
created a false environment you to fall into, how do I know as the acting agent that that's what's happening?
So the driver of movement in that moment would be the lowest form of free energy would cause the action because it would cause stability in the agent is what would be argued from the active inference. And I don't know if that's at odds at what you're saying either. It's just what is driving the behavior and kind of how are we describing that moment, I guess, is where you and I are having some odds here.
I
Um,
mean, maybe
yeah,
possibly
and
because
this was just fun. Yeah, this just was just fun. This was what I was looking for.
Yeah.
Uh,
But again, I mean,
yeah.
that's all fun and good. But I don't understand how we would, again, you started to describe how you would change practice. You started to say something you would isolate and then you kind of went off. Let's move back to that because I'm really curious. When you say isolate, can you further describe what you mean by that? If you want to teach someone how to feint, for example, or fake?
Well, I want to stick to jujitsu, so I'll keep
Okay.
it in that. So let's
Okay.
just say we were playing some jujitsu game, and the initial game was that I had to step in towards your guard, open guard in some form or fashion, make connections. And the original game that we're playing doesn't have a a statement on what direction that partner is going to fall. And then I might then add some level to this where, hey, did do a reflection? Did you notice that when you step to this particular area, that this is the likely outcome of what that person is doing? And so now what you're doing is utilizing predictive approaches to then reduce the amount of energy in the system to engage with perception action.
So
Does that
are
make
you
sense?
reducing the energy by adding a new level of perception to the system, or are you adding to it?
Well, this is I guess the debate here is that I believe that that modular system works in real time.
But what I'm saying is, so now let's assume that we perceive. I can see when a leg is coming to me, and based on my current capacity or understanding of how the game is played, I can respond in a set of
Yeah.
different ways. I see it, I perceive it, I act upon that thing, and I'm doing it in real time based on the senses, the information I actually use to move. But my coach comes in and says, "I want you to look for this." To me, that's adding something that I now have to try to perceive. So and it adds more noise to the signal, or not even that. Maybe it masks the signal altogether. Maybe you think you see something that's important, and you ask the student to search for something that's important, but he does not perceive that. So how do you know that? Well, first of all, adding that in seems an additive. It doesn't seem like you're making it more efficient. It seems like you're making it less efficient. And how do you know that that intervention is going to hold true for each athlete? And it's in fact that intervention that will allow deception or the using deception to enter the system.
I mean, this is, I guess, where the variability comes in. And in the, again, we're just referring back to the active inference approach, would be that the very nature of the refining of that system makes it more efficient and this is where you obviously don't agree with this it is in favor, it is in support of um, identifying affordances in that manner. It's just reducing this, I guess, the search area behind that.
Right.
So,
So here's the thing. So I'm actually not just, I don't like, I wouldn't care. Like if someone popped out tomorrow and said, it's true, the brain is going through this, Bayesian inference, this thing all the time, and it's updating models to try to reduce, prediction errors, blah, 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 blah. I'd be fine with it because again, I would think that it happens directly. And as long as like, that's truly what I'm hearing too, right? So it's happening directly. That's fine, blah, blah, blah. No worries. But that
yeah.
doesn't mean that we intervene as coaches by giving them more to perceive, like especially something that's not actually there. So when a coach says something, look for this, you're giving them basically a symbol, something that's not really there, because what we bite on, what we act upon is personal to the individual. And I don't think that we can actually get at that as coaches. Not in my 10 years have I ever felt confident telling somebody to think the way I do or to see things the way I do. I don't. And I've never found it effective. And that's anecdotal. That's anecdotal. But I don't think that saying the thing really has that effect.
So when the research, and of course we can throw this number, and I really wanted to stay away from saying research at
No,
all
please.
today because I wanted
Who
to,
cares? Because I'm
yeah,
curious too. Maybe you'll guide
yeah.
me somewhere to learn something new.
So I did look. I have looked a lot into kind of how this is seen in the research end of things, and what seems to be the case here is that as long as you are keeping it within the system, with the that the focus of words are to external focuses, right? So follow the hip or keep your belly button here, all those kind of things and when I said isolated, I was afraid to use that word because I don't want to say to remove from the context in many ways. What I want to
Okay.
do is keep these things coupled. I'm with you here. But what I'd be getting at here is that ultimately you're keeping the system coupled. So for example, we were talking about the card pass. That search criteria, I kind of lost my train of thought for a second. My
No,
apologies
it's all
on
right. We're
that.
still talking about you just trying to add deception into the
Yeah,
mix. We can train it as part of the system. And by you gave the example of trying to tell a student that when they step in, we're going to look for this level of
yeah, and it would be
interaction. So
less
you're going to try to.
information. Yeah, and so again, what I was saying about the less information is that I mean, there are a number of ways that that system can change, right? As you step in, the environment's going to change. Um, from a mechanistic standpoint, if you are able to reduce the error that may occur, your system will act quicker.
Okay, great. I
And I
agree. So, be, if the thing that we want to happen is more perceivable, or the affordance is more salient, we're more likely to act in the intended direction.
we agree
So,
that, yeah.
okay, so how does your intervention increase the efficiency of that search or that
So again,
interaction
like
or
again, I wanted to
that prediction?
research, go back to the research. It seems to refine the search criteria, right?
Okay,
When so that is the general broad. I don't want to go too detailed, and I'm happy to provide a lot of this for you. But yeah, that it is sharpening the search criteria. It's because it's localizing the focus
okay.
point.
So we're changing their focus of attention to something that we want them to perceive in the environment by telling to look out for a thing, correct?
I suppose you could put it that way. Yep.
So give me an example of what we would be telling them to look out for that you think would have a positive net benefit over time through training and the performance outcomes.
Again, same scenario I was talking about, where if you did it, you played a game over and over again of entering the guard, and the bottom person had no direction on which they were going to move. And then later on, you know that you would then reflect and practice. Well, hey, did you notice anything about every time they stepped? Like, yeah, when I stepped in this particular location, the person kept falling to this side of their hip. And when that happened, these were the options that I had moving from there.
How did they get knowledge of those options? Where are they pulling that information from? Why is falling on the hip critical?
Direct engagement in the activity.
Okay, so then they have to catalog
Update.
opportunities for opportunities for action of previous hip downness, and they have to remember those options, and they're supposed to
No,
trigger.
those nope. That's where that updating of that modular system, the brain, comes in. That's where active inference would be saying that these aren't cataloged in a folder. That these are real time active updates to the modular system as a whole. That's directly connected to the active engagement that we're talking about.
So then, what do you mean by options then?
Excuse me, explain a little bit more what it, like when I
Well, you
said
said that
passing. Okay, okay, yeah, yeah,
if they
yeah.
notice the hip falls down, they could have these options. What does that mean? So if it is something that's updating in real time online, it's live, and it's used to enhance what they can do with hip downness. What are options? Where do we store them? Where do they come from? How do they affect us in that moment? How do we select from them? Are there things we select from? Are there
So
only
I got
three?
to be, I potentially should have used a different word other than options, because I wasn't, again, saying that this meant a catalog of things that we're going to do. What I meant by options is when you land, let's say you fall to a hip and I end up on your side in some form of um, connection to you, and you're on your right hip. There is now probabilities that are going to occur on what can be done or not done in
What are
those
those probabilities
scenarios.
based on?
The relationship between you and I, and whatever temporal constraints and so on and so forth.
Okay, and what is the base of that relationship?
Expand on that.
Why do we move in one direction or another? Why is there an option, and why do hips fall down, and why do we act upon them?
Well, I would always say that the general state is to stay in a set in a the agent wants to stay in the lowest form of free energy. So it's always going to act on things that are going to reduce that stress, and the way it does that is by having prior experiences.
Okay, but again, all that's cool, but like, why do we move?
Well, this is where ecological dynamics in many ways has a great this is I'm cool with the saying that. I don't fear conceding a lot of what ecological dynamics has to say about why we move. um
So I think it's really simple. I think all that stuff could be happening, but I think at a pragmatic level, uh, we intend to do things.
yeah.
When we act out into the world, there's information presented to us, whether it's already there, we create it, it's within the sport, what's in the context, whatever, that we pick up, that we notice or we take on as an opportunity for action. And then again, it's the intention we have relative to the opportunity and our current capacity that allows us to move. So what I would do as a coach is I'd put people in an environment, give them something to do that they could act upon, or in an environment with lots of opportunities for action, and I would have them try to bore out their intentions to try to develop a deeper understanding of the relationships between their intentions and the information out there that affords them an opportunity to act in their intended way.
Well, I don't want to take up any more time. I thought that was fantastic. I had this whole other list of things that we could have hit, but I don't want to do, um, I think we've been now an hour. So I really appreciate it. Some of the stuff that I was reading, that I just got a book that it was interesting that you might like, is Skill Acquisition in Sport, and it's written by Dave Collins. And he
It
kind of
just came
takes a
out, right?
look at, yeah, it just came out and I just started reading it. And it kind of, I literally only am in the intro part, so I don't really know how far, what it's going to say going on. But it seems to argue for more of a hybrid approach to skill acquisition.
Before we leave,
Um,
that's because that's the thing. Like this whole thing was couched as we were going to talk about a hybrid approach, and I
who said
really want to.
that?
Oh, sorry.
I didn't hear
When
you.
you,
You said, so hold on, and then you cut out.
oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay. When we on the little thing you made, you said you wanted to talk about the hybrid. That there
yeah.
can be a hybrid, and I'd like to know. Before we go, I'd like to understand what that means to you, because this is a thing I hear all the time, and people are like, "Oh, hybrid is the way," but no one can give me a clear answer of what hybrid is.
Well, so I didn't want, we didn't get into it, but there is a lot of research in the youth world on like 5 to 7 year olds and scaffolded learning in those younger years, and some forms of explicit instruction. And I imagine, and even in the occupational therapy view, they view those as, you could view those as constraints. Again, it depends on what you view the model as, right? If it's an updating system or not. So there's a lot of research in youth about using explicit instruction before you have them engage in the activity, and so there's some implications there.
Okay,
So the hybrid.
but explicit instruction is not hybridized. I mean, explicit instruction can be used in an ecological framework, and it doesn't.
Well, so
We
maybe
think
you say that, but there are a lot of people that are, and this is what I call, in a way, like framework creep or construct creep, where you don't. This is why I wanted to talk to you, because hearing you say that is different than so many people who are saying on the ecological end
yeah,
that
we
there should
don't
be
know.
no.
Read
Right,
the
I know, but this
literature.
is good to have this
Read
discussion.
That's why, like, dude, fuck me, man. Like, fuck all the people online. Read the researchers. They have a clear view on why they're saying what they're saying.
Right,
Explicit instruction is a tool, but that tool has an effect. And the effect that has is not that lasting, and it's not that salient for a learner. It has some value early on in the attunement, stabilization, coordination phases, but that it disappears very quickly. And an explicit instruction has other problems too. It can't get at nuance. It's in and of itself a little bit linear, assuming that I say this, you do this. So it's kind of
right.
it's not the strongest tool we have, right?
I wouldn't agree. I think it's a great onboarding tool to then to the engagement with the environment.
It could be, depending on how complex the nature of the task and environment
Correct.
is. Could
Correct.
be, right? So, for example, in discrete tasks, it doesn't seem to matter whether we constrain it, but with external things, or we talk about it. It seems to have almost, they don't really seem different. So it seems like neither of them matter. Actually, there's something else going on. So that's
Yeah.
cool. But in complex continuous games, explicit instruction fails very quickly, and it hits diminishing returns almost immediately after being used once somebody can do a thing. So, but again, explicit instruction has nothing to do with the hybridization of information here and information out there. Because when people say hybrid in the literature, that's what they're actually talking about. They're not talking about explicit instruction. They're talking about the nature of information and how it affects the mover.
Um, well, so I'm comfortable with any representation. If you don't feel that that's a comfortable representation, one of the things, and I'm not accusing you or anyone really of this, but it does, and this could be my own ignorance. It does seem as though that the ecological approach, and maybe by the very nature of its research, has grown, but almost in some ways has almost shifted goalpost on what is what going on. And so I don't know, and I'm not a specialist in it, but that seems from a generalist standpoint that it has shifted, it has changed. Okay, so these different things. So when I say hybrid, I don't care what you want to constitute it as. You say this is an ecological approach. I believe on depending on the task at hand, explicit instruction is important. It also matters to the degree of what age group we're working with, what skill level, what cognitive abilities they have, working with people with perceptual issues and cognitive issues. So all of those things become really important in the coach's toolkit. And so if people are, yeah, and so I know you're not disagreeing with this, but there's so many people who have this dogmatic view of how, you know, ecological dynamics can be it's not a blanket tool for all systems, for all
The truth is
learning modes.
ecological dynamics is a hodgepodge of different ideas that the researchers, scientists are trying to turn into a real idea now. So it's this idea of the task environment agent system.
Yeah.
Now we have internal and external folks with attention added to it because of Gabrielle Wolf, and then we have dynamical systems, and it's kind of just strung together. And there's actually a researcher named Job Francenson who does meta-analysis on the strength of studies to determine what's the strength of the scientific information we have on a given topic. And the truth is, for skill acquisition, we don't have that much.
Well,
In his view, anyway, there's not the strength of the research is not where we need it to be to make hard claims, which I'm not in disagreement with at all.
cool.
But
Then we're great on that as well. Cool. That's
Well, of
awesome, man.
course, because again, I'm not worried about truly what's happening at that like research level. I only need the research to enhance my ability to work. So if I can take your idea and I can apply it, and within that application phase, I can get performance outcomes to change, and that's what I'm going to do. Now, I'm interested in the research. I'm interested in science, and I think it's really beautiful and unique stuff. And so I read all of it. But when someone says hybrid, that means something very specific. It's not just should we use explicit instruction or not. Again, explicit instruction is a tool. It's not separate from ecological dynamics. It's not separate from a constraints-led approach. It's just in that field, that tool is not heavily used because it doesn't have the effects that the other interventions could, right? But again, where's the hybrid? That's before we leave, I just want to make sure we kill that thing.
Well, I
Where's
guess
the
in that
hybrid?
sense,
What are we hybridizing?
I'm happily going to concede the statements what you just said. If you're comfortable, and you don't own obviously the approach and some of these things, but what I was really hoping to do one is tease apart some pieces. But in the hybrid, quote unquote, because I want to answer your question directly, is my opinion was that explicit instruction is important depending on the context, depending on the age group, depending on cognition. And that has been seen for many people online, and maybe this is just because this is uninformed, as a hybridized approach. Now, if you're like, nope, this is all CLA, sure, call it whatever you want. I think that what my bigger argument, right, what we're trying to have here is the ability to choose uh, proper treatment protocols or coaching protocols that will encompass ultimately the skill acquisition in its most robust fashion.
Sure. So I think
So
no matter what
again,
we do,
we're you and I are really talking circles tonight, and it's not a
oh no,
bad
it's
thing.
okay.
It's
I don't.
fun.
I'm fine.
Yeah.
I'm fine. Uh,
We have someone saying keep
oh
talking.
yeah, yeah. I know this guy. He follows all our stuff.
Yeah,
Um,
he lives close to me.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess the big thing is like context is
Right.
everything. So we have to understand how the component parts are interacting with any given context, because through understanding that, we can more closely determine what interventions are going to have the performance outcomes that we're looking for. So if we're talking about something with low urgency, there's going to be tools that work better for low urgency situations. If we're talking about simple discrete tasks, there's going to be interventions that more affect performance outcomes better than complex continuous tasks. If we're working with somebody who has very fearful and it's going to be a rate limiter to which they can engage, then we're going to have to use certain interventions to get rid of that as a constraint so that we can speed up the learning process. You know, if we're working with an aging population as limiting factors, we're going to have to determine the interventions based on that. None of those things are separate from ecological dynamics. What's going on online is nobody understands what the fuck they're talking about because no one's even trying to engage with the information. It's crazy. So hybrid has nothing to do with the conversation that you and I are having. You're saying hybrid. What you're actually saying is what interventions relative to the context, but
Yeah.
that's not hybrid.
Well, okay, and I'm sure I'm happy to concede that that's not hybrid. I don't really care what we call it. The guy that Dave Collins calls it the PJDM approach, which is the pragmatic judgment and decision making approach. We can call it whatever we want to call it. I don't really care about that term. I used hybrid because it's the most accessible and easy for people to
But I think
understand.
it's actually
Uh,
confusing because I think the conversation, if you're paying attention to the conversation in Jiu-Jitsu community, people are taking an emotional standpoint on what's being said, and they're not actually doing the reading on either side,
mhm.
right? They're not even watching the videos they're buying. Like most, the average consumption rate of the videos that seen through by analytics is about 5%. Like nobody's actually really engaging in any which way. They're just jumping on the comment section and looking at clips, and they have feelings about it, so they type it out furiously. Nobody really knows what
Yeah.
they're talking about. So when people say hybrid here in the Jiu-Jitsu community, what they mean is they want to give explicit instruction based on step-by-step movements. They want to teach in a linear fashion, but they want it to have an effect of nonlinearity, which it doesn't. Those two things do not merge because they have different effects on the system, and they have different effects based on the context in which we're engaging.
Well, I agree with everything you just said, and that's why I started this conversation with the backbone of skill acquisition. In my opinion, is going to be a constraints-led approach. So I didn't want my argument was not that, but I guess I using the word hybrid embodies that to
Well,
you.
only not to me, but to the conversation that's being had. Like when someone says hybrid to me, I'm thinking about based on why ecological dynamics even exists. So they're trying to, what they're saying is the environment and our interaction with it is extremely complex. So we don't know what affects what really. So we basically know that these whats are actually interacting, and it's the interaction that's the what. So it's the component part over here and the component over here bumping into each other that cause the emergent thing, and that's what we're trying to understand. We're taking a non-linear approach to skill acquisition. So
Right.
separate from a linear approach to skill acquisition. So in our view, it's an argument about information and the nature of the information present, how it affects the system. But so when you say hybrid, and we're talking about these fields, that's what we're talking about.
So I mean, but by the very nature of active inference, it is a hybrid approach. It's predictive processing crossed with with ecological dynamics. So I mean
No, I would argue that um, they're continuation of the same thing. I think they're
what
trying.
active inference is a continuation of predictive
I
processing.
No, I think that active inference is a way to add more to the view of direct perception. I think that
Okay, but we just got on the same page. Yay. For sure. That's what I kind of think I said before. It's in support of in many ways. It's
if you
trying
read the
to,
literature and you listen to the guys that talk about Bayesian inference and all this shit, they
yeah.
will say it's not at odds. It's not at odds.
But that's not, and I'm saying the same thing. But if it's not at odds in some ways, then I believe it has some implications on what it is. Are things predictive in nature? The neuroscience, and this is kind of what the world of cognitive neuroscience and neuroscience as a whole. It means nothing to you, but
I'm not saying it
well, maybe it does.
means
But
nothing to
they
me.
lean very heavily towards the brain in some form in some form, in some fashion, is a modular predictive and I don't want to say machine because that sounds top down in approach, but it's a predictive modular
It,
system that
if
directly
if it
go
is,
ahead. Right. And we
it still perceives directly.
right.
So
And I'm with you on that. But it does to me from a philosophical, from a therapist standpoint, then bring in some other implications that are maybe outside of jujitsu directly, but permeate into the world of
for
jujitsu.
sure, like I can't. Again, my expertise, if you can say I have any, is coaching jujitsu and
Well,
understanding
that's
grappling, and that's
kind of
what it
why
is.
I wanted to bring this unique little view because I think you're a specialist in jujitsu, but from a clinical standpoint, we see these mixing and melding often of approaches, and we see that there's an interface of what seems to be active interference, which is using ecological dynamics as a driver for a lot of the rehab, but it's also using some of these Bayesian predictive qualities to improve that rehab, and so
Well,
yeah.
the nature of a rehabilitory environment is different than the nature of a sporting environment. They're not even in the same context. They're not even in the same field.
I would say that they do share. I would say I agree in some fashion, but they do share some similarities. And if we can sit back and look from a macro view at just kind of where there's some overlap, and there may be some inference that we can make over the other sport or the other activity, and there's maybe some parallels that we may not see otherwise. And this is, and I don't know, if which approach is true, but that's why I originally tried to start with like I think they are. Um, Compatible with each other. I think I've said that multiple times, and I don't think you've denied that either. It sounds to me like we're very close in many ways, and just
No, because I
um,
listened to your original thing you put out, and you said in the original thing that we use linear and nonlinear
no, that I did
approaches.
not say that. I did not say that. What I said specifically was that there's camps of linear and there's camps of CLA, and people flood to either side. And I said ultimately it comes down to utilizing the proper tools at the right time.
Sure.
And so
Uh,
that to me would be fair to say because there are some in some ways linear learning in regards to young kids and that kind of stuff. So that's not wrong. It's just the
what would be an
application
example
of the
of linear
or
learning for a child in a
explicit.
sport?
No, not in a sport context, in a rehab context. But if that's the if it's the case that we use some of those tactics, not always, but they are some good onboarding tools. You admitted it yourself.
Yeah, give me
Those
an
are good
example of
on
linearity and a tool and a linear tool that we use to increase something that a child may do.
like in a rehab sense.
Well, I mean, I don't know anything about rehab, so even you could say that holding an egg while blinking with one eye makes your hand-eye coordination better. I couldn't deny you because I don't know anything about it.
Well, so like explicit instruction will be giving some if this then that will build some scaffolding for that child, and then they then have some again we could return it back to scaffolding or I mean search criteria where they're engaging in that initial understanding of the activity to then engage in some form of activity where the actual skill is being developed.
Explicit instruction by its nature is not it's not fundamentally linear.
Okay, fair enough. I
So
guess I mean I'm pulling a lot of research and again like that these are supportive positions that are seen in the med field and I could be wrong. There are some feedback loop systems that I'm not really very well versed in that use what they said information processing when you read some of these books that are talking about information processing in feedback loop systems. Now I don't know, I'm not a scientist to be able to make the true determination. But these things are clearly being claimed to be used in the world of rehab. And if I'm wrong, perhaps I'm wrong.
no,
That's
I
fine.
again, like I don't read anything about rehab, and the thing is again, as the context changes, the intervention must also change.
Agree with you wholeheartedly, but if there is some flexibility in the description of interaction as a whole, like we're describing right now, then that begs the question that there may be something beyond just what we can describe. Ecological approach is very descriptive in nature. I don't think it's not mechanistic. And again, we just have this fundamental view that I believe mechanistic is very important. This is why the world of quantum mechanics and Newtonian physics are trying to find a unifying theory, and I think that we're going to see the same thing in the future.
Okay,
We're
but
seeing
again,
it right now.
yeah. But I just don't understand how we have this conversation as at a pragmatic level where we talk about interventions that are necessary, that are linear, that can be used in a nonlinear system. Because that's good. Again, that's what I'm curious about. Like all the other stuff, whatever. It you know. So again, I just wanted examples of this so I know like what we said when I leave.
Examples of what
Linear,
linear teaching.
yeah, linear interventions and how they can affect nonlinear. It's not nonlinear systems.
I Why did we not agree that explicit? So you are saying that explicit instruction by itself is not linear in its nature.
No,
Let me
so
get that clear.
it would be here's how we make explicit instruction linear. First, you're going to step your foot in between the knees. Then you're going to step to your left. Then you're going to push the knees to your right. Go. So that's an expectation that those things exist and I can do those as said against resistance.
So
As soon,
I would
so
okay.
it would fail immediately because as soon as they start engaging, legs don't move like that. The environment does not engage like that. It does not have that type of relationship. So it would fail immediately as an intervention.
So,
So
as
if
an
we,
intervention in rehab, we might be using linear as an instruction about if you put your knee in this position, and we would be using external cues as well to reduce, an injury, right? So, if we're dealing with a rehab stroke patient, if this, then that. is a very linear approach. So if you put your arm here, this is what's going to happen. That's giving them that's a linear explicit instruction.
But it's the happening that makes it linear and nonlinear. So, for example, if you say you put your arm in this shape 4 times a day, you're going to heal. That's linear. That means
Yes.
that four movement has the exact effect that we're using it for. Nonlinear would be something like this. Throughout the day, you want to try to move your arm to 90 degrees and out whenever you feel comfortable. If you have a sensation of pain as you're doing this, stop right now, wait a few hours, wait till the next day, try again.
Yeah. So, but what you say,
But they're both
let me,
explicit.
yes, I agree. But and maybe I'm going to sound very silly for asking this. When you are giving, so very explicit instruction of things that have to happen to prevent injury, like your arm has to be in this particular position, it's very linear in nature.
In what context?
In the training portion of like a rehab onboarding
Well,
process.
if there's nothing acting against the agent and the arm being there has the intended effect of the explicit instruction, then the linearity of that is fine because, again, we know the input, we know the output, and it works. But if we're working within a system where the input output ratios are not known, linear interventions don't work.
Okay, I mean, I guess what ultimately what's going to happen is I'm going to have to dive back into why the medical world is utilizing antiquated approaches. It
Oh,
seems
most
for
likely
yeah,
because of funding, poor understanding, insurance
maybe
issues,
perhaps.
the way people engage in the community. There's probably like a whole rash of reasons, right? Truthness, effectiveness is not the bottom line for any given, you know, monetary system.
Well, for sure, but I mean, there's also a lot of, I mean, that also, in the very nature of what you said, downgrades a lot of great work and medical
Well, that's
research.
part of
So,
the issue. And that's something they talk about in research anyways, because getting funding for what you do sort of pushes research in one direction over another. We see this problem over and over again, whether it be the way we create gyms in jiu-jitsu to keep students here versus truly understanding what makes students better at jiu-jitsu. There's a fundamental misunderstanding there and it causes strife. And same thing happens in all areas and again, this is jumping the shark a little bit, but this happens in all fields where money is involved.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I wouldn't disagree with that. And you and Mike had kind of agreed on that in your discussion on how the quality of what quality research can be in varying degrees. Well, it sounds like to me I wasn't able to answer your linear question, so I apologize. And yeah, I mean, I don't know if you have any other questions. I know you wanted some clarifications from me.
Yeah, man. No, I think, these are conversations always fine. I'll do them anytime you want. It doesn't really matter to me. It's just that, I'm pretty well read on my subject. I've been applying it for over 10 years. And this is not, I've talked to researchers who write this stuff. Luckily enough, I was able to have a little thing with Keith Davids a couple weeks ago, which was beautiful for me. Talked to Rob Gray on the regular. So, I'm very well prepared to apply what I think is going on because I do the work. And so it'd be nice if any of this conversation would come with equal measure. You know what I mean? Rather than
I
just
thought
these.
I tried to have a good faith discussion with you and
Oh
come
yeah,
to the
no, this was
table well,
great.
Rod.
No,
Um,
I'm saying that to people watching and
okay,
listening, not you.
okay,
There's
yeah,
other
yeah.
people.
I
It's not
thought
just you
I,
and
yeah,
I. If it was
yeah,
just fucking you and I, we'd just be bullshitting over the mic, man.
yeah,
Like
yeah,
I got to talk to the 17 people who are looking at this right now.
yeah. So I and the final thing I would say is I very well could be wrong. I'm pulling from work as well. I know the field is growing all the time, and so for the people that are listening, I was pulling some of my work from a PhD Davis and the active inference model, which tries to kind of bridge the gap between our cognitive understanding in neuroscience and ecological dynamics. And I thought this was super fun,
Does
man. You gave me some positions that I was like, oh, this is tough.
does that guy have like a channel where he shows how he used active inference in sport?
Yeah. So if you type in Dave Collins, he is, well, he just wrote a really big research paper. He's not the main guy. So for his stuff, he kind of covers it in professional judgment, decision making, and action adventure sports. So he talks about the role of interaction in that. Um, and then if you his book, the book on skill acquisition, does kind of do almost like a meta analysis of those things and kind of compares it to kind of some other
Okay.
research.
Okay.
So I don't know what its implications are fully. It would have been nice to get through that before we had this discussion.
Yeah.
But I know it's really it's its dynamic and its review of its critiques of multiple different models, not just the ecological dynamic. So I'm excited to get through that.
Sure, man. Well, if you ever want to have a conversation in the future, if you have anything you want to share with me that you think is groundbreaking or really cool, I'd love to hear it. Like I talk to people I disagree with all the time. Like I had private conversations back and forth with people on the side of predictive processing, people on the side of active inference,
Yeah.
and we have wonderful conversations. And I've softened my view quite a bit interacting with them, and it's been really great to hear opposing point of views and how they're utilizing it in their training. So if you can ever do that for me, I would be very happy.
Yeah, man, I really appreciate your time. That was what I was hoping to do today, at least a little bit, and have kind of just this open volley of different ideas back
And
and
also,
forth. And I wanted to make sure.
you
Yeah.
train jujitsu, bro.
Yeah.
Like, why don't you fucking come here?
Oh, well, dude, unfortunately, man, I've had 4 shoulder surgeries and I'm actually getting a surgery next week on my knee. But once once my knee heals, I will come through. I've wanted to come through. I've just had such significant issues with my health. I've been almost bedridden for 6 months. Honestly, it's been terrible.
Dude, I'm sorry,
Um,
man. It's
yeah, yeah,
terrible.
yeah. It's okay. It's I the week before Worlds, I had a gnarly infection and ended up in ER, and it was just terrible. But
Where in the US
I'm
are you, man?
in Connecticut, and
Oh,
you
you're like right
yeah.
there, man.
Yeah, yeah. I planned, I actually, I wanted to have this conversation with you. The way this kind of came about was way off, not how I anticipated it, but I thought it was a great opportunity because I care. I, and I'm not naming any names or saying anything. I want to be very respectful. I felt like a lot of times you've had discussions with people where you couldn't even get to have fun and play with some of the ideas. And I thought that I would be able to kind of play in that sandbox a little bit with you compared to what you've done before, which is just try to get people up to
Yeah.
speed.
Well, I mean, we were just here sharing ideas,
Yeah,
man. It's great. You
yeah.
know, I think people tend to think my directness is combative and they respond to it and we end up going at it. You know what I mean? And
I honestly said to my girlfriend today, I think the problem is you don't have an opportunity to shine because of kind of the nature of the discussion you're having. Can't even get into those areas. So I was saying today, my goal isn't to play a combative game with him. My goal was to just have an idea and play, get a little closer to what we think might be the truth and improve practice design. Um, and what you're on record today saying a lot of things that I don't know if you've said
oh,
before,
I
which
have.
is cool, right?
Have. Just people don't listen to the right ones. So oftentimes when I get to talk to people that actually are researching the subject, it's a very open and honest conversation. Like, you know, typically what I do when I talk to people who come unprepared is I hold their feet to the fire on
Yeah.
purpose because it's like, dude, why are you even here? You know what I mean? Like, why did you even bring me on? Why do you want to have this discussion, dude? Like, so, but you
Well,
didn't do that, so it's fine.
well, I had a feeling that if I didn't do that and I came well read and I came passionate about the subject, we might be able to have some good things. You asked me some tough questions today. It's fantastic. I'm an avid reader and I don't care if I'm wrong. And so it was fun to have some points where I felt uncomfortable. And it makes me want to go look at
Yeah,
some of the research. And yeah, that was it. So I
sure,
really
man.
appreciate your time.
Yeah, well, I feel uncomfortable all the time, so I'm just fucking like inside I'm a mess like
Yeah.
90% of the time. So I'm just used to
Yeah.
it. So I just look like I'm fine.
Okay, well,
Um,
I appreciate your time. And I will definitely take you up on coming through at some point. I can't even drive at this point right now. Yeah, so once I'm out of that, I'll definitely come through and I'm sure we'll have this volley again at some point. And yeah, that's it.
one thing, and we can bounce. It would really be cool. I know you got the surgery. I know you got to heal. I know you got to get things fixed. But even if you come here in a coaching space, which would be amazing, just being on the mat and seeing like what I do live and in person and how I interact with the students, and even maybe sharing some of your interventions that you've used historically that have helped you as a coach and help you with your students. I would love to see. So again, once you're healthy enough, you just want to come through in a coaching capacity. You don't have to train. We can sit and bullshit, blah 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 blah, and we can actually do the work in front of each other right here on the mat.
Yeah, I think that would be super cool. And I think that will help drive our conversation a little bit deeper, so we can start to kind of watch in real time what's happening and kind of poke and prod. So I think that would be fun. I mean, tinkering at the end of the day in the space of what we're doing is important. So
I
yeah.
agree. It's
All right,
everything.
man. I really appreciate your time, and I'm sure I'll see you
Yeah,
around.
bro. Take care.
Thanks. Bye.
Peace.